Well, hello, biology students, and welcome to your latest installment of your virtual lesson. Today, we actually have a twofer. We're going to look at two sections today, two separate topics. One topic is on cell cycle regulation. What are some things that control the rates of the cell cycle? And the second one is on asexual reproduction, reproducing without gametes and without a mate. Let's talk first of all about cell cycle regulation. There's two different ways we can classify these as external factors and internal factors. External factors, these are things that happen on the outside of the cell. These are things that the cell actually perceives from the outside of itself. One of them is whether or not cells are touching each other. When a wound opens up in skin cells, the cells next that were usually next to each other have been torn open. They realize that, they go through the cell cycle rapidly in order to close that wound. Once they're actually in contact with each other, then those cells will start to slow down that process, and they should actually stop so that we don't overgrow and create a big scar in an area of an injury. So whether or not cells are actually in contact or touching one another, they can feel other cells around them, and that will regulate whether they are going to be dividing rapidly, going to be dividing slowly, or not dividing at all. Other external factors include things called growth factors. These are chemicals, hormones usually, which signal the cell to go through the cycle more rapidly. Two examples of this are HGH, which is human growth hormone, and EPO, erythropoietin. Let's take them one at a time. If we look at this man in the picture on the left, his name is Andre the Giant, and you may recognize him. He was a professional wrestler back in the 1980s, 90s, and he was enormous. I think he stood something like 7 feet 7 inches tall, weighed in excess of 500 pounds, and just dwarfed normal sized men that he stepped in the ring with. The problem was he had a tumor in his brain where his pituitary gland was, and his body produced way too much of this human growth factor. And so even from a very young age, he grew really rapidly and grew very, very large. Um, Although there may be some advantages to being a very large person like this, Andre did not live long. He died in his early 40s due to complications with that condition. So the growth factor does make the cells divide more rapidly. It does make them grow faster, but you can always have too much of a good thing. And I think Andre's case, that's what happened. The other growth factor I want to talk about, erythropoietin. This is a hormone which causes red blood cells to divide rapidly, and it makes them at a much higher level in the human body. People who go to high altitude to train, what happens is their body perceives they need more oxygen, and it produces this hormone erythropoietin to make more red blood cells. And so that's why a lot of elite athletes like Lance Armstrong, pictured on the right here, go to high altitude to train to make their body produce this hormone and get more red blood cells and therefore more oxygen. However, this is also a synthetically produced chemical that some people, like Lance Armstrong, can take illegally. And that's what Lance Armstrong was accused of. What he admitted to was cheating in using this particular hormone to boost his blood cell counts. It causes red blood cells to divide more rapidly, go through the cell cycle more rapidly, and makes him have a higher red blood cell count than his competitors. And with more red blood cells, you carry more oxygen and you go faster. And so, unfortunately, Lance had to give back his 7 Tour de France titles because of his abuse of this particular external growth factor. So, these are two cases where you can have too much of a good thing. Under normal circumstances, they work normally and they help the body to run. But in cases where too much of a good thing happens, it's not good. Um, there are also internal regulatory factors. Your DNA will tell your cells when they're supposed to divide, how many times they're supposed to divide, and when they're supposed to stop dividing. And depending on which type of cell they are, or where they're located at in the body, certain cells will divide more than others. There's also enzymes within the cell itself which will tell the cell whether to speed up the cell cycle or to slow down the cell cycle. Enzymes called kinases, these are like the gas pedal. These will help speed up the rate of cell division. And cyclins, these are like the brake. These will slow down the rates of cell division. So the cell can kind of regulate itself and tell itself to divide more rapidly or less rapidly. Another type of regulation within the cells, this is also occurs as an internal factor. It's called apoptosis. And the definition of apoptosis is programmed cell death. Certain cells are supposed to die at a certain stage in their life. An example is the webbing between the fingers of a fetus. When we were all this size, we all had webbing in between our fingers and in between our toes. And at a certain point, those cells were supposed to die. That's called apoptosis. If it went right, then each finger should be separated and there should not be webbing in between. But the picture on the right shows an example where that process didn't happen properly. And so those cells between these two fingers did not die as they were supposed to through apoptosis, and therefore some webbing was left. Usually this is pretty easily surgically repaired, but in this case, obviously it wasn't. So again, certain cells are supposed to die at a certain time. That is called apoptosis, and that's a programmed cell death. When cell regulation goes wrong, we call that condition cancer. And what cancer really is a condition where cells go through the cell cycle uncontrolled. They go through it rapidly, they grow rapidly, and they divide, and they will never stop. They divide over and over and over again. And they can divide so rapidly they will overtake normal cells that surround them. Two types of cancer cells you can have. One of them are called benign cells, and one of them are called malignant cells. The benign cancerous cells are cells that, although they make a tumor and can overgrow surrounding tissues, will not break off and spread to other parts of the body. And as long as it's in a fairly safe place, it can be easily removed and safely removed. Malignant tumors, however, are bad because they can break free or metastasize from the tumor and spread to other areas of the body. And so these are much harder to treat and cure because you never know if you've actually gotten every cancerous cell out of the body. And if they spread to other areas, particularly vital areas like the lungs, the heart, the brain, they can lead more directly to death. Benign tumors generally don't get to areas like that. So we generally tend to call benign cancers ones that are not terribly harmful, and we generally tend to call malignant cancers ones that are much more dangerous. What causes cancer? Well, cancer is caused by an error in the DNA, particularly the DNA that controls the rate of cell division. And whenever that occurs, the cell is not going to function normally. And so there's a problem there. This could be caused by an actual gene that's inherited through families. They're called oncogenes, and that can cause cancer rates to be much higher in certain individuals, certain families. Or they could be caused by other external factors called carcinogens. Carcinogens are some sort of substance that can cause cancer. Things like radiation, tobacco smoke, UV rays from the sun, toxic wastes all can be known to cause cancer. And the rule for carcinogens is the greater the exposure, the greater the risk. And so the longer someone, say, would smoke cigarettes, tobacco, and expose themselves to greater amounts of these carcinogens that are in it, the greater their risk for cancer. So how do we treat cancer? Once an individual has cancer, we have to stop these rapidly dividing cells. Two common ways that are done are radiation and chemotherapy. Radiation actually uses high-speed particles to bombard the cells directly, and as long as the tumors are localized and they haven't spread, radiation can be a very effective treatment. If the cancer has spread, then something like chemotherapy may be a treatment that's necessary. And what chemotherapy is drugs or chemicals that target the fastest dividing cells in the body. Since tumor cells are the fastest dividing, they often seek those out and kill them. However, since hair cells and skin cells and fingernail cells and blood cells also divide rapidly, they may also be affected. People on chemotherapy can get very sick from this treatment because they are losing some of their cells that need to be replaced all the time. And often people with chemotherapy, because hair cells divide rapidly, will lose their hair. And so that's often a symptom of chemotherapy. If the treatment is successful, though, since the tumor cells divide so rapidly and they would be targeted first, it may knock out all the cancer in the body, and that is the goal of chemotherapy. Okay, so that is cell regulation. We talked about some internal and some external factors, and we talked about cancer. I also want to spend a little time and talk about asexual reproduction. Now, this is the process of reproducing without needing a partner, and so these individuals or organisms would produce offspring all on their own. And how this relates to the cell cycle is all that we need is a simple division by mitosis to create more cells. Those cells will eventually break off and become their own organism. For example, this Picture on the left here, this is a hydra. This hydra would have gone through mitosis, produced a whole bunch of cells sticking off their side. Now they've differentiated into their own little hydra, and this hydra will eventually break off and swim free. This is called budding, and it's one of the examples of asexual reproduction. Picture on the right shows a whole bunch of people that are all identical, and these may have been produced by the process called cloning. Cloning is where you take one adult cell and you actually turn that one cell into a fetus. When the fetus is born and grows up and develops, it will be genetically identical to its one parent. And if there are multiple copies, if there are multiple clones, they will all be identical to each other. And that's what this picture is showing. So asexual reproduction is going to produce offspring that are exactly the same as the parent and as each other. What are some advantages of that? Well, first of all, it does not require an individual to find a mate to reproduce. If the population is low, it's hard to find a husband or a wife, and so they don't have to. They can simply reproduce all on their own. And instead of a husband and a wife, or a male and a female, producing 10 offspring, each individual can produce 10 offspring. It's more efficient, it's quicker, it does not require the mating process, and so it is much more efficient of a reproduction than sexual reproduction. If the organism is well suited to its environment, the offspring will also be well suited to the environment, and it can help their chances of survival. So in terms of efficiency, asexual reproduction is a good thing. What can be bad about asexual reproduction, though, is because all the offsprings are identical, we have no variety, we have no variation. What can happen if there is no variation? If one asexually reproduced organism gets a disease and it dies, then all are likely to get that same disease and also die. If one gets sick, they all get sick, is kind of the rule for asexual reproduction. Example that is the case of banana trees. Since bananas don't have seeds in them, all bananas have to be asexually reproduced. They are reproduced by cloning or budding or something with the banana trees. And so every banana tree in the world is almost genetically identical because they've all basically been produced from the same stock of um, the original plant. And therefore, if one of the banana trees gets sick, all are likely to get sick. And a few years ago, at some banana plantations in South America, there was a fungus disease that spread through these plantations. And when one banana tree got sick, they all got sick. It wasn't a big deal as long as that disease was localized, but it has since spread from South America over to Africa and has spread to some plantations in Asia, and it is kind of spreading around the world. And at one time there was talk that you could actually see banana trees going extinct because this fungus disease has kind of overtaken them. Without the variety, genetic variety, we don't have the ability to fight off this disease, and therefore we may see the end of bananas, at least for a while. So we can talk a little bit more about this case in class when we get there. So that's definitely a disadvantage to asexual reproduction. And if you learn nothing else from biology class, you should know that variety is a good thing. Variety helps organisms to survive. Asexual reproduction does not give that variety. All right, so that is your lesson for today. So we will follow up more with this in class tomorrow, and I will see you then.